Hello everyone. In today's lesson, I want to show you how we can take advantage of a protected pass pawn that we have versus an isolated pass pawn that our opponent has. Now, in this position, if we compare, both sides have two pawns, both sides have has a passed pawn, while the difference is that the black's passed pawn is protected by the g6 pawn, while the white's passed pawn is isolated. Now we know that isolated pawns are pawns that don't have pawns on the both files that are next to them, which means that these pawns are weak. And in general, any pawn is weak if it cannot be protected by other pawns of its own color. Now, here, let's see. To study this endgame, we also need to remember the concept of the square of a passed pawn. To draw the square of a passed pawn, we need to draw a diagonal in the direction of the last rank where that pawn is supposed to promote, and of course in the direction of the opponent's king. So here, if we draw this square, what do we understand from this? If the opponent's king is inside that square, it means that this king will be able to catch up with the pawn if the pawn just moves forward, and the king will be able to capture it before it promotes. While if the king was outside this square, then the pawn would be able to promote and safely so keep the queen. Now, if we look at the square of the black's passed pawn, we can draw again a diagonal in the direction of the last rank where the pawn is supposed to promote, and complete a square. If the white king is inside that square, and if we just push our pawn, the white king is going to be able to catch up and capture this pawn and stop us from promoting or capture the pawn when it promotes. Now, let's see. What are different plans that white can have here, and how can we continue? Let's say white decides to sacrifice the passed pawn that they have, the b pawn, so that they capture our passed pawn. Okay, so to do so, let's say white is pushing their pawn. They want our king to move away so that when we move to c5, they can move their king to e5. Why move to e5? Let's see. If white wants to capture our pawns, white cannot capture the h5 pawn because the h5 pawn is protected by the pawn at g6. Now, this means that if white needs to start by capturing, they should capture the pawn at the base first. So g6 pawn first. So say we captured the white pawn, and white moved to f6 to capture the g6 pawn. Now that looks like a very good plan. If white can capture both of black pawns, now it's even winning for white, but it's not, because we have to remember that we just saw the square of the passed pawn, and this was the square, and by moving to f6, the white king got out of this square, which means that now we can safely push our pawn and we will be promoting without the white king being able to stop us. Now, but what if white tries to do the same thing? Just like we're promoting, white tries to promote their pawn. And here, let's see if we go, we continue, we promote first, and then white is promoting. Now here, this endgame is another endgame study that we should know, is that if we already have a queen and our opponent wants to promote with their pawn, it's on the 7th rank, we can stop that pawn from promoting, but it's a whole other study. But we can just see an example, and in general I can say that our plan should be moving the white king behind the passed pawn, and when the white king is behind the passed pawn, we will take advantage of that and get our king closer, and together with our king and queen win the pawn on g7. Otherwise the queen alone cannot stop that pawn, cannot capture. The game would end in a draw. So king and queen should work together, and by forcing the white king to move behind the passed pawn. Now of course white is going to try to avoid that, let's say, but we can see an example of how we can make white move behind the passed pawn. This is an example of how. And whenever the king is behind the passed pawn, we just get our king closer and closer, and we will help our queen capture that pawn. So let's go back. We tried the first choice that white had, trying to sacrifice the pawn on the b file so that they capture our pawns, but that one didn't work. Now what if white tries to keep their pawn? Let's say if we're moving to capture that pawn on b4 and white tries to stop us, we're moving to capture that pawn and white wants to stop us. Now here I wanted simply to move to b5 and capture the b4 pawn next. Now what if white is stopping us again? Again, we should not remember that the white king cannot go too far and cannot leave the square of the black's passed pawn. Now here, if we look at this position, white just went out of that square, which means that I can simply push my pawn without worrying. The white king will never be able to catch up and capture my pawn. And if on the other hand white tries to do something on the queen side, it's not possible because our king can't stop their pawn. Now going back, we just need to remember one thing with black in this position. The most important thing, the reason why we won this endgame, is that our passed pawn is a protected passed pawn. This means that at no point during the game where the white king is within the square of this passed pawn should we ever push our pawn. Because, for example, if white pushing their pawn and we move in that direction, or at any moment we move our pawn as well, when the black king is still in the square of that passed pawn, okay, the white king now is still in the square of that passed pawn, and we decide to push the pawn for some reason. We shouldn't, because as long as the white king is inside the square, white king will just leave everything and go and capture our pawn, because our pawn won't be any better anymore than the white passed pawn. It will be alone and it will be easy to capture by white. So our advantage is that our passed pawn is a protected one. Let's keep it protected until the white king is out of the square of that passed pawn, and we can just push our pawn to promote safely without white being able to capture us.